This is Big Man Tyrone, and you're about to watch the MtG Cabal cast with your hosts, Hoard, Thirsty, and Reptile. Sub to us on all your podcast networks at MtG Cabal Cast and YouTube.
All right, guys, welcome to the newest episode of the Cabal Cast. This week we're covering a topic that kind of a sore subject for a lot of people, and that's market manipulation. And what market manipulation is versus a market correction, how all that stuff works, et cetera, et cetera. Something that, really is common when people talk about the reserve list, but happens elsewhere as well.
Oh, yeah.
So, with that said, let's get started.
Yep. So this is actually almost a direct follow-up to the pod from, I think it was 4 weeks ago, where we talk about what it was like, or what we would have to do to kind of ensure that the secondary market moves smoothly and that there were no, bad actors in the space. And what happens in a market like this is you do open yourself up to market manipulation because there are no controls. And there are a number of ways that this happens, most often just through effectively buyouts or removal of product from a marketplace. Every now and then, I don't know how often people still check in on MKM, but there are some large vendors there who do sell sealed product. And when they are individuals, when they go away, all that and put themselves on vacation mode, a huge percentage of that product pool is thus removed. Sometimes people freak out. Now, that's not market manipulation necessarily. This is just what happens. We can have these swings naturally, or we can have, a bad actor come in, an individual or group, and just buy out a ton of product and move the needle.
Yep.
So the way I broke this out actually was to just look at it in regards to an actual marketplace like the stock market and the kinds of manipulation you have there.
Yeah.
And one of the things that comes pretty quickly to mind for me, and I guess this kind of hit the zeitgeist, was what one person called the Great Pyramid Schemes did, which was last summer bridging into the fall. It was a thought experiment, and this thought experiment has been done several times, which is just if I take a reserve list card that nobody cares about and I start buying it over time in low quantity, nobody's going to notice when it moves or when it comes close to disappearing. And then when it's ready to disappear, I come out, I mention what I'm doing, I post the photos of all the ones I have, and this creates FOMO and a huge price pop. Now, this is the graph of pyramids, and you can see this card was flat even through the advent of old school. It just hung around $60 for whatever reason. The average was lower than the market, but nobody played this card, and it has been mentioned across the cast on our quick hits, etc. But then you see that there was a jump to almost 750 when people freaked the hell out, and then it settled at about 300. Now, this is a great example of ramping or false demand, where it was one person doing all of this, and in time they put out their mission statement. They put up all the photos of the pyramids that they had, what their plans were for the card long term, and their next target. And this does parallel to the stock market. This is illegal, kind of? Not quite.
And a regulated market, sure.
Yeah. And this is something that you do see from time to time where it's just, well, why the hell all of a sudden does this card that does nothing all of a sudden do something? It's because somebody ramped it.
Yeah.
They just created FOMO, try to get a couple buys, and then they're just going to sit on it till the end of days. Different from a pump and dump in the magic world, but this is a good example of ramping. So,
another example of something you can do is just a targeted buyout. Specific example, there's a couple of them that the Cabal did. One was Pendromists, and one was Hatred. And if you look at the MTG stocks graph, you can see that they each hit their peak in May, July of 2018. So this was literally an example of, and I was one of the driving forces behind Hatred. I saw that it was at about $6. It was reserve list. Supply had started drying up a little bit. And then I checked MKM. And I was able to get about 300 copies off of MKM for around $700 total. Shipped, whatever. And I was able to buy list every single one of those for at least $10. Because as drying up the supply in Europe and moving it over here, this is something we talk about vendors doing to SATA demand. And then I bought up the American market. And when that started happening, people started getting FOMO, similar to pyramids.
Yes.
Now, the difference, especially in the case of hatred, is that it caused what we consider a market correction. Because prior to that, the low was around $6. Your market was sitting at around 10 to 12. Since then, the floor on the low has doubled to $11, and the market is still sitting at around 13 to 14.
Yes.
But what you see is that when that ceiling raised, the floor corrected. So this is an example of, rather than market manipulation, a market correction.
Yes.
Because demand existed, it was sated, and the price was not appropriate for demand. So when people say a card like RIP Fires of Invention is too good to be a dollar card. Okay, you buy it out, the market corrects. Hatred was too good to be a $5 card. Mm-hmm. Bought it out, the market corrected. Conversely, your pyramid example, not quite the same.
Nope.
And Pendromus being the other example I gave, prior to May, it was around $4 low, spiked up to 20, and now we're at about $3 low.
Yep. Another good example of this is Wheel of Fortune. You take a look at that card, and before the most recent spike up to over 150, the card Wheel of Fortune went from a $20 card in 2016 and climbed almost naturally to be a $100 card in time.
Yeah.
The price of this card was holding steady at about $100 for close to a year.
Yeah.
And this was an example of a market correction. I think I mentioned this on a Quick Hits episode, basically as an accelerated timeline, because the market could bear this price. It will bear that price. What happened in that jump to 150 was just a targeted buyout on the card to attempt to raise the floor and see if it was a new sustainable price, if you could cause a market correction with Wheel of Fortune. Yeah. I honestly forgot about Hatred because I didn't move in on that at all.
Yeah. That was one of my favorites personally. But, you know.
Another good example, something along the lines of Pendril Mists. It's the definition of this is a run, and this is what happened with the Legacy deck, Popeye Stompy, the Pirates deck. So a run is basically when
perfect timing.
Yeah, when just information is leaked, it's not quite legitimate, there's no attributable source, and all of a sudden there's just a run on a card for a reason, or a run on a stock for reasons that people can't understand, and it's not really supported. What happened was, you see...
What happened was...
Richard and Brigand and a number of other pirates in this deck just started getting bought out because of Bob Wong and a group of actors on Twitter who just wanted to kind of do this for fun.
And then Saffron buying in.
Yep.
Thanks, buddy.
Pushing this narrative that there was this Legacy deck that was just crushing the format, going 4-0 drop so that it would never hit a 5-0. And then as people, I think like Drew Levine and Julian Knob jumped on the train once they were kind of led into the background of what was going on in this thought experiment, that there really was no deck. And a couple days or a couple weeks after the original tweets went out, it was now time to say it was a 5-0 deck, and to hope that their list would make it through the WotC gatekeeping of Moto decks, because shortly before that, WotC changed their policy again on how many 5-0 decks would be put out online for people to kind of follow. And the interesting thing about these cards is, if you take a look at it, it's hard to see, there is no market price for this card up until it spikes. Only after it spikes does there become a market price for this card. So there was no demand before this at all. Or for most of the cards that eventually Bob Wong leaked in the list and put in his article on Channel Fireball. So again, as a run, this was just purely a rumor that eventually became reality, cited as a thought experiment. And I'll put a Wikipedia link up to definitions of various pieces of market manipulation, and you read the definition of a run, and I'll also link the Channel Fireball article. You can see that without knowing what they did, they created a run on these cards almost to the T by definition. And this is a great example of market manipulation. I don't think we've really seen anything like this prior and post, where all of a sudden there was just this kind of like thought thought experiment's a bad word to keep using here, but they just, perpetrated.
It was a meme.
Yeah.
They perpetrated a troll, basically, to see who could buy into it, and then they did. And, it caused all these cards to spike. And I also can't remember a time where it was like, literally just a study in sociology and the behaviors of Magic players, where they just did something like this, they ran with it, and it just blew up.
People started creating their own deck lists because they had no idea what was going on. So, as you mentioned, Saffron Olive, quote-unquote, bought in, but I think he only had what he could glean from the tweets and filled in the rest.
Yeah, and I remember the tweet where he was like, somebody please give me this list. They're dropping at 4-1. I need to know this list. Yeah. And that's when he started buying in, and it sort of took off. And that was a prime example of a run on this card that's just incredible.
Yeah, I picked Brigand because Bob Wong purposefully called out that card in the deck, and it's one of the only handful of rare pirates from Masks era that, in theory, was played in the deck. They eventually did put up a list. I think somebody did manage to 5-0 with some pirate pile eventually. But it was brilliant if you watched it happen and you watched people fall into this punji pit, like obvious punji pit. But
yeah,
that was a good example.
Great.
Oh yeah, 100%.
And that's also good because that's an example of, something that didn't necessarily have anything but pure FOMO behind it. Mm-hmm. And I do want to say that it's common that this kind of thing happens with reserve list cards, because so far all of the cards we've discussed have been reserve list in nature. But there are plenty of times in Standard, or even in Modern. So 2 years ago when Bridgevine premiered, a friend of mine was at the Pro Tour. I asked him the day before, hey, what's the deal? What's the hot tech? And he said, these pros are really high on Vengevine. Buy your Vengevines. You can see, if you look at the Rise of Eldrazi Vengevine on stocks, there are multiple times now where in 2018 and then in 2019, we went from a low period and it spiked. And then we went down a little bit. And each time the market is correcting after a seeming run, more or less. Mm-hmm. Also, of course, you have an Ultimate Masters reprint in there, which doesn't necessarily help things. But it's a good example of this can happen for something that is playable in a non-reserve list format.
Oh, yeah.
Because you do see where, looking at the rise compared to Ultimate Masters. June last year, we were at $30 for the Ultimate Masters one, and then it sort of petered off after that Pro Tour happened.
Yeah.
And it's just an example of it's not necessarily just reserve list cards that this can happen to. This can happen to anything.
Oh, yeah. Wild Defiance, I think, is another good example. There was a Modern Pro Tour several years ago where the deck de choix was Infect, but not a lot of people tested Infect for the Pro Tour, and Wild Defiance was kind of like the techie answer to Bolt-based control or aggro decks.
Yep.
And Wild Defiance went from bulk to dollars, and I think the foil still holds a decent price because of that. The card has effectively fallen off. There's a better answer or better option in Ixalan. I just don't know the name of it, so I can't bring it up.
Shaper's Sanctuary.
There it is. There's a better answer in Shaper's Sanctuary, but Wild Defiance still holds a price because of that.
Yeah. And this is the case where you kind of have to look to the pros for innovation to see when this stuff is going to happen. And there have been times in the past where vendors have had a sponsored pro team. They see, great, this card is doing really well. Let's write an article about it. Let's push it at the Pro Tour. Like it's just common. Star City's done it throughout their history where they have, all right, we want to push these singles. Let's try to make them work in a format. Someone writes an article. The article takes off, and all of a sudden the cards dried up everywhere because, Jerry or someone wrote an article about it. Okay, Jerry.
Yep, and that happens awkwardly more than you want to think. At Detroit, I think 2013, the fall after Return to Rav was released. We had not gone to Theros yet, but there was a vendor there who had a pro team at the time, and they came around Saturday, day one of the event, early in the morning, and dropped off at every vendor a list of cards that they were buying. And on that was Desecration Demon for the price that we were selling.
Yep.
This vendor was buying infinite Desecration Demons for the price that we were selling.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if we had hit Theros spoilers yet, but the idea was that Desecration Demon was too good for what it cost, and people had already begun experimenting with it on their team. They needed the copies, and they wanted to get out ahead of whatever wave, was coming.
You can actually, if you look at the stocks for Desecration Demon, you can see it in August of 2013. It goes from $2 low to almost $9. Because they went in, they hoovered up all the copies, and they tried to push it with their pro team.
Yep. There it is, yeah. And it takes over at the Pro Tour, holds in the format for a couple months, and eventually comes down, despite the fact that it was one of the best decks in the format, even through rotation. But it's interesting how that happens. Speaking on reserveless cards, we mentioned Pump and Dump before. It's kind of like the biggest and brightest beacon we have for market manipulation. Is the easiest one to point to, aside from insider trading, quote unquote. And Pump and Dump can effectively be done with anything. It can be done with a reserveless card. It can be done with anything low pop. You can buy into a spike before it happens with Desecration Demon. If you are not that vendor, just an individual, and you happen to have that list, you could get out in front of it. You would pump up your not your position on the card, but you would pump up the card itself, the idea of the card, and then dump your copies into market. Doesn't quite work that way with Magic. It's very hard for one to pump up the idea of their spec, when in reality you're just pulling copies from the market and then dumping them back in once it picks up.
Yeah.
Things we can point to easily are like Grim Monolith was just spiked, it's a combination pump and dump into FOMO, where not a buyout per se, and this card is perpetrated, but it was bought out under a certain price threshold, copies restocked to move the market price. As you can see on stocks, there's a gigantic delta between market and average, and that allowed the people to reset the average by relisting their copies at a higher price than they bought, solidifying their position on the card by bringing back in some of that lost capital. So they'll break even. The success rate on something like this with the Grim Monolith buyout, fairly low, because the demand just wasn't there. The other two we can look at are Thrasios Triton Hero. Same thing, perpetrated by a number of people in a different group, bought into that card, resold their copies to move the numbers on a card that just saw little demand. And Tymina, the Weaver as well. Same thing. You can see the price spike very clearly on Tymina, and then it just kind of settles. And these guys were selling into FOMO. They have pump and dump exactly like this. Move as many copies from the market as they can to kind of snap the price, make that shoot up, create a bit of FOMO, relist their products even if they wind up quote unquote drop shipping to them, and bring the average up to meet the market at some point, and either remove these copies from the market entirely or continue to sell into whatever demand exists.
Prime example that I'll cite, because it was one that I was semi-responsible for, was Helm of Obedience. 2018, you see where it goes from low 12 to a peak of, low at the time was around $50. So over the 2 weeks prior, I'd slowly started picking up copies of Helm of Obedience. And then when TCG got below 100 copies, I bought 60 of them that were LP or better.
Yep.
Just hoovered them all up, price spiked, and I started selling them off. And of course, I dumped them to buy lists as quickly as I could. I also posted on Facebook that I have, some Helms of Obedience, and here's a picture of like 60 of them that are available. And then a bunch, FOMO hits, and people start buying them because they think they're all gone.
Yes.
And when you do that, it's with the knowledge that you're not necessarily seeking a market correction. You're seeking a short-term, it's just like shorting a stock.
Yes.
That is effectively what a pump and dump is. I'm shorting my stock. I'm getting it out the door after I, pull a little bit of manipulation and pump up the price. And that's another prime example of market manipulation that sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the price sticks like Hatred, and you're like, well, it was a market correction. But worst case, it's a pump and dump, and you're fine.
Yeah, then the idea behind that is to move quickly. If you are not part of the initial movement, you're going to be buying into a pending spike or into an already spiking card, and your profit margins are going to be much slimmer. So to keep up with people that are selling at a lower price, your margins become close to zero, even negative sometimes after fees and shipping. So it's difficult to want to buy into a position like that after you have heard that it has begun.
Yeah.
It's also difficult to buy into certain pump and dump positions when you're not sure where the demand for something exists in the first place.
Yeah, also very true.
Some things look good on the surface, like resetting the floor on Grim Monolith. It's most likely fine in the long run because Grim Monolith is a card that can hold a higher floor as reserve list. It's iconic to a point. It is quote-unquote required for a handful of formats, but it's a nicety for the most part, and thus demand overall is very low. Buy lists will rise in time because copies were kept off the market, and large companies have the ability to just sit on maybe 4 forever, and when they sell one, they'll buy another one eventually at a price they like. The Commander examples that I gave, those are the hard ones to move in time because you're relying almost entirely on FOMO for those 2 cards in particular. If you check Rex for those 2 cards, they're not very highly played from that Commander season. Moreover, there does exist the opportunity for these cards to be reprinted in the upcoming Commander set. So buying into something like that where there looks to be low demand and you have a possible incoming reprint is very difficult to want to do. You have to be sure of your position, be sure you can absorb a loss, and then know what your outs are almost immediately. Or ensure that you can at least break even before you're left with a stack.
And that's another prime example of like something that's important to keep in mind with investing in Magic in general is the reprint hazard, especially now.
Yes.
When we have Spellbook Chandra that just got spoiled today. I don't know, maybe it's Spellbook Chandra or whatever it is. Just got spoiled. We have, the EDH set coming up.
Yep,
we have Double Masters. We have all these reprints, and that's one of the things is you need to be mindful when you're trying to invest. What are you looking at?
Yep.
Because that is something that leads to a lot of people losing out on like a pump and dump or trying to cause a market correction is they just get hosed by a reprint.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, you're basically left, pants down, like, what am I going to do?
Yes.
And that's why, if full unsolicited advice, if you want to start experimenting with this, personally, I'd say experiment with a few pump and dumps first before you go for a market correction, because one of those is significantly longer term than the other.
Yep. I purposefully sought a market correction. I'm sure I've held up the graded beta shatters that I have. That card was beta shatters near mint were selling for $8, which was just entirely too low overall. So I bought a bunch out. What was remaining on TCG Player, nobody relisted. A few more people in our group bought in, and then we all relisted on TCG Player to raise.
Yep.
We reposted between 30 and 50, depending on condition and grading if it came back, and eventually raised the floor to something real. But we were able to absorb the $50 or so each that we would have to spend to correct that card purposefully. Yep. We were willing to do that. We have I don't know if we pumped and dumped, honestly.
No, I don't think so. I still have a bunch of my copies though, so maybe I'm
not even Shatter. Like we've mentioned Temporal Trespass, we've mentioned Soldavi.
Excavations was definitely well that was a meme, but I guess that could have been seen as a pump and dump based on the results. Oops.
At the end of the day, what happened was a pump and dump for sure. But we generally try and keep our movements guided towards the long term, so we're more interested in market corrections. We would rather absorb copies and eventually float the market price of these cards up to something that we believe is a little more realistic than what exists. Yeah. And that does kind of inflate the ego of what we're doing, but we're not really heroes in this regard. We just have a position that we think should be better.
Yeah.
And
so act accordingly.
Yeah. If you can, go for it. If you can't, you just have to hold back and wait. And then wait for markers to roll in. People who are paying attention to this, people who are swing trading or day trading effectively to let you know what your cues are.
Yeah.
To move in and see if you can buy in quickly. That kind of stuff. Unless you have any other examples, I'm ready to move on to picks.
Let's hit the picks.
All right, cool. I'll go first because mine's a little more cut and dry. So my pick for this week is Dragon's Hoard. This is a card from M19. Let me pull up the stocks graph. That basically just sat really quiet at about $1, and in the last couple of months has just had a really nice slope, a really nice price slope, slow and steady, and it's starting to hit buy lists now. CK was buying. They've been buying copies for a number of weeks now, although the number has finally begun to dwindle. They're currently buying, 4 copies at 90 cents, $1.17 in trade, which is now about 50% of what TCG's market is on the card.
Yeah.
But that number has stayed fairly high. Their demand has not been sated, and the price has not dropped this entire time. So they still are churning through inventory. This is a card that if you can buy it for close to $1, and it looks like you can... This is difficult because there are a lot of single copies here with like 75 cent shipping, which means you're going to pay what buy list is double, but this is a card that you should be able to pick up easily, sit on, and be okay with. It does one specific thing, and that is allow you to play a big dirtily dragon EDH deck and recoup some kind of value by being on that plan. And the reason I like this card compared to some others that pay you out for playing a specific creature type is because this is attached to dragons, which is probably one of the most casual tribal decks that you'll ever see in EDH after angels.
Yeah.
And there are a ton of people that will just play dragons. Even if you want to combo out with Scion of the Ur-Dragon, is that its name?
Yeah.
Yeah. The Ur-Dragon, I'm sorry.
Ur-Dragon.
Yeah, which is one of the top commanders for this card. You can still recoup value with this card. Oh, there's Scion and the Ur-Dragon, both of them. Okay, right? You can recoup value immediately with this card because all the dragon has to do is hit the battlefield. You don't have to cast it. So you saw Zerlin of the Claw on that list as a top general. That keeps you in mono red, but Zerlin is effectively a sneak attack for dragons. So every time you just drop a dragon in, you're going to draw. Perforos Bronze-Blooded is also on this list, down towards the bottom, and that's basically a brand new sneak attack as a general.
Yep.
So you can literally just sneak at a bunch of dragons and win. Otherwise, this deck does exactly what it needs to across all 5 colors and play big dirty dragons that want to take a couple big turns and eventually clear out the game. And this is a great casual card. If EDH demand isn't driving this card, then it's kitchen table magic, because this is not a card that people are just going to buy a ton of over time. This is a card that just kind of floats by, the Crucible of the Spirit Dragon, the 5 land for dragons, right?
Yeah.
Is that it?
I think it's Crucible.
Yep, Crucible of the Spirit Dragons. Yep. Right? That just floats by, and it had a very real price until it was reprinted. These fit in the same decks, the same paradigm. Without a reprint, this card's just going to climb. If you buy in now at $2, you probably will not be remiss in. If this slope continues, I would say probably 12 months at the most you can get out of this to buy lists at a decent profit if you buy in right now around 2, just because I do not see this card dropping in price. It does have eminent reprintability because it's so generic.
Yeah.
That is definitely a fear to have. But I don't know if we would see this in a standard set again. This was in M19, which came either on the heels of... M19 was not on the heels of Cons, but there were no dragons in previous standard or in standard thereafter. This was made specifically for the EDH crowd. I don't know if we'll see this card come back again. I highly doubt it. It's just going to be a slow and steady gainer. So
yeah, I think it's a really solid card, especially, like you said, the only risk here is reprint. Obviously, casual EDH is the way to go. Mm-hmm. As we've talked about, it's one of the most popular formats. It's the only format that's financially growing right now, while organized play is basically dead.
Yeah.
So I think that's, especially right now, something that's important for people to keep an eye on and try to get into, because once organized play starts again and people can go to stores, I would expect, obviously, all formats are going to do well. I would anticipate casual EDH doing significantly better.
Yeah. No, yeah. And like I said, it's a really interesting card. It plays a number of roles in recouping advantage because you can draw a card, or it's a mono rock for your dragons.
Yeah.
And,
Other one is pretty solid.
Yeah. All right. Yours is a little more interesting.
Yeah. So, kind of on the casual EDH train still. I'm specifically saying here the comic book art Triomes from Ikoria. Now, we're in kind of an interesting spot with Ikoria. There's not a lot of limited that's being played. There's not a lot of product being opened because of that. There's not constructed standard happening. So financially, it's one of the lowest value sets we have seen in a very long time. And these alt art cards have an iconic art style that has mainstream credibility and is something that casual EDH players are going to love forever. Example we'll just cite right now is Zagoth Triome, the most expensive one, is sitting at about $9 with shipping included low on TCG right now.
Yep.
The others are anywhere from $6 to $8. I think these alt arts are criminally underpriced. They're a very good early target for pimping out your EDH deck if you're just getting started. It's something that the more people play EDH and get the 36 or whatever it is, where it's every color combination.
Oh yeah.
The more these are going to sell. And it's something that people will always pick up. They'll take it to even a trade. Mm-hmm. They'll give it to even a trade. So they're incredibly liquid. And I think that right now, while we have an incredibly low demand and an incredibly low supply, hear me out, is the time to buy. Because we're not getting more supply after this. And this is a sneaky card that I think is going to go up quickly. Mm-hmm. Especially when you compare, Zagoth is about $9 for the showcase. We're sitting at about, $8.50, or sorry, $6 for the non-foil pack. Yep. And then it shoots up to $7 and $8 very quickly on TCG. So there's not a lot of disparity between those two, and the showcase art is market improvement over the card, and it's a good low-grade pimp that you can use in EDH or Legacy.
I don't know, absolutely. Some of the comic art, I don't understand why it's so cheap if the cards have utility or are just generally good in some respects. The Triomes outside of Showcase are definitely a card I would wait to pick up on rotation, but I agree that earlier is better on these Showcase or comic or full art, whatever the technicalities for them are.
The lands are now, yeah.
And the nice part about this is that even if they do reprint the Triomes, because they will finish the cycle in time, and this is a kind of thing just like the Buddy lands from core sets prior and the Innistrad check lands that were reprinted in Dominaria.
Yeah,
we will see these again at some point because they're not tied to a set really, but we're not going to get the same comic art again.
No,
we might get the same set art, but this comic art should be unique each time. I don't foresee them reusing it. So as an investment piece or a utility piece, I think the Showcase is definitely the way to go right now. I picked up my Narsets that way, sitting on a box on my desk, because it was $8 or $9 or whatever it is for the Narset that was already seeing play. Seemed ridiculously cheap for that card because that art is so unique. Also, it speaks to me because she looks like Sub-Zero. That's
classic.
Yeah, that's neither here nor there, but that's why I bought them.
But that's another example of these. The kind of nice thing about them doing a million different versions of every card now is there are versions of the card that are effectively reprint proof. And when you have the Showcase that's so stylized like it is, it's not something they're very likely to revisit in the future. So be it Narset, be it the Triomes, I think it's a good time to get in on them while there's no demand for these cards outside of EDH.
Yeah, exactly. I would have fought you if these had the same art as the set, because that means that eminently when they get reprinted, if they continue to do the Showcase stuff by the time we get there, then you're going to walk face first into that into that issue. But with the unique stylization, the unique look, the low demand for the majority of these right now, the utility they serve immediately, it seems like even if you just want to own a set, by all means, pick them up. Yeah,
It's worth it.
absolutely. No, I like it. I think we might wind up picking up some of the more showcase cards, as we go through, because that's all we have right now is EDH.
Yeah.
And there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit for EDH. A lot of my picks that I'm tracking for this pod, and almost entirely EDH. And I have a sneaking suspicion that some of these showcase cards are going to work their way on there once they drop a little bit, especially once the demand for Toho has begun to dry a little bit, which seems odd. If demand would dry, why would price go up? Because people will have stopped opening them. They will move on to the next set by the time that happens. And then as something unique comes around and makes them more desirable, we're going to see a run on those cards, and we will just not have the supply to support it.
Yeah.
So keep an eye on that kind of stuff.
And unfortunately, until Paper Magic comes back, which if you follow us on Twitter, you'll see that there's some rumors circulating that we may not be getting Paper Magic for a while now.
Yes.
Obviously, Wizards said no more, and Channel Fireball events looks like it might be on the way out. And if that happens, GPs next year are going to be pretty interesting. So
absolutely. But that is going to be it for this week, guys. Thanks for bearing with us through these trying times.
Yep.
It's crazy out there, and we had to delay a bit for various reasons, and we're lucky to get it in today. But we'll be back next week, and we'll see you guys then.
Yep. See ya.